The forum, the ARCO Forum at the Kennedy School of Government. I'm Charles Royer, the director of the Institute of Politics, and since I've only been here 2 months, I thought I could not miss this opportunity of welcoming, for my first time to the forum, our president, Derek Bach, and to just say a word of welcome to our distinguished guest for the first of the Tanner lectures that we've all been looking forward to. So with that, for purposes of introducing our guest, would you please welcome the president of Harvard, Derek Bach.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you all for coming to join us at this year's Tanner lecture. I should say, by way of introduction, that the Tanner lectures exist at some 7 American universities, plus Oxford and Cambridge, and we have a floating university or two that could be in China or Africa or the Middle East. It varies from place to place, but it's a way of making sure that the lectures roam about a bit, as well as existing year in and year out at the same universities. The lectures are named after a singular individual, Obert Tanner, who did some graduate work here. He put himself through a school at the University of Utah, and then did graduate work at a number of institutions, and eventually spent his life teaching philosophy, again at Utah. Some of you may wonder, especially those of you who teach philosophy and understand the munificent pay scales that prevail in that particular branch of academe, how Mr. Tanner would be able to endow a series of lectures at no less than 9 universities plus a floating university around the globe. And that is a curious tale because it all started when he had to make his way. He was the youngest of an incredible number of children in a Mormon family, and the money ran out, and if he went to college he had to do it on his own wits. So he began a little jewelry store in the basement of the house in which he was living. And he never quite gave up the jewelry store, even though he was doing all the graduate work. He left it in charge of his sister, went on teaching at Utah, kind of managed the jewelry store with his left hand. But nonetheless, so great was his genius at business as well as philosophy that he developed the most successful purveyor of industrial jewelry or corporate jewelry in the country. And if you're ever in Utah, you should visit the factory, which he runs along Platonic lines as a place where all sorts of enlightened practices are observed, and I must say it's a very happy place for those who work there. But it is also a very successful place commercially, and that accounts for these lectures. The aim that Mr. Tanner has, in keeping with the form of philosophy he practiced all his life, is to try to use these lectures as a way of encouraging outstanding thinkers and scholars to write and talk about really important basic questions of human values, not in some narrow, specialized technical form, but to provide a larger treatment of important subjects accessible to larger and wider audiences. And I know Mr. Tanner would be very pleased by tonight's lecture. Mr. Gellner, I think one can say, has taken as his life work the fourth of Kant's great questions, what is man? And he has pursued it not in any narrow sense, not cabined by any single particular approach or special discipline, but through all sorts of prisms: psychology, political theory, anthropology, sociology, philosophy. All sorts of strains run through his work. His interests, apart from the different disciplines, are equally wide, from Soviet ethnography to Berbers in Morocco, with many places in between. He was born in France, educated in England, taught at the London School of Economics, and since 1984 at Cambridge University. It's a really great honor and pleasure to welcome him to our midst for these lectures. And without further ado, I have the great honor to welcome and to present to you Dr. Ernest Gellner.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, well, thank you for the honor conferred on me. And I'm very pleased to be able to honor C.I. Lewis, whom I didn't quite meet. I think we didn't fully overlap. It's a great honor, and it's extremely scary to address an audience like this, but I'll do my best to do justice to that kind introduction. Well, the notion of civil society is in the title and is what I'm going to be concerned with. What might be called the Atlantic society, Atlantic civilization in which we live, in which it's both sides of the ocean, has taken civil society for granted, rather like speaking prose for some time, but in recent years has come to be aware of the fact that it is speaking prose. The notion is becoming central, and I'll try and highlight it by a kind of negative approach, by looking at places what don't have it. It's where it's absent, and the nature of the absence, which may illuminate what it is that we have and what it is that we do have. The positive characterization is not something to which I have anything very original to add. I think we mean by the presence of a valued civil society that society and state are not coextensive. There's something else in society other than the state, and this something else is not subservient, passive, or helpless. That's roughly the minimal the minimal intuition or the minimal content that notion has. Now, it's acquired a kind of salience or prominence recently, which is connected with the importance of what is happening in the eastern and southern, eastern and southeastern neighbors, at any rate, of the European part of Atlantic civilization. Now, to the east and to the southeast of Europe, there are basically two kinds of societies: Marxist and Muslim societies, and they will form they are the substance of my present preoccupations, and I'll try and characterize them. To say I'm sharing my thoughts with you is a bit pompous, but it's true in the sense that not only do I have no confident conclusion, I'm not even sure that I've worked it out properly. It's work in progress, and you'll have to share not my thoughts but also my confusion, my chaos. But I hope that even without conclusions, I at least succeed in highlighting the questions which have to be asked here. Now, the point about both Marxist and Muslim societies is that from the viewpoint of Atlantic civilization, they share a central and very important characteristic. They have extremely weak, occasionally, some would say non-existent, civil societies. The state is too strong. The rest of the social institutions are too weak. This is what they share. There, as the phrase goes, the resemblance ends. The interesting thing is this astonishing contrast, and the very highlight and dramatic contrast between those two worlds in other respects. They are both quite unique and, so to speak, extreme. Let's take Muslim society first. The main characteristic, the most conspicuous characteristic of the Muslim world is that it blatantly, brazenly defies something which sociologists have been saying for a long time, namely that modern society gets secularized. Now, by and large, it's true. There are countercurrents and exceptions and qualifications, but by and large, what is true is that in modern society, religion loses its hold over social and political life. It's not absent, but it's less powerful than it was, and this is the overall well-established trend. But there's one dramatic and absolute exception to it, namely the world of Islam. The political and social clout of Islam is at least as great now, and in some respects considerably greater than it was 1 or 2 centuries ago. And there's no, I don't go in for prophecy, but there's no sign so far that this is ceasing to be the case. And this is a problem. And I'm not saying it's a problem in the sense that it's necessarily a bad thing. It may or may not be. But it's obviously an intellectual problem. One wants to understand what is it about that particular world which makes it different from the rest of mankind. I mean, at the end of the Middle Ages, if you like, there were 4 great civilizations between the Pacific and the Atlantic, and 3 of them are to different extent and different degrees and different forms secularized, and one of them is not. And why not? That's question number 1. Now, to switch to Marx, the world of Marxism, we have witnessed last year, I think, one of the great and crucial turning points of history where something has become very obvious, namely the virtually complete loss of faith in that, I mean, what of course the Marxist societies, the Islamic societies share, that both were idiocracies, both had an absolute doctrine claiming to explain the role of man in society in the world and to have the truth about them. Both in their social arrangements claim to implement truth which is in their possessions, and in one of them that faith has almost completely collapsed. And that again, it seems to me a unique phenomenon. I can't think of another example of a society which publicly and demonstratively and conspicuously abjures its own past and its central convictions, not completely without ambiguity, very near, almost completely. One can, of course, think of plenty of examples where the past is abjured and disavowed, where there has been a change of regime, where either through internal revolution or through external conquest, the identity of the power holders change, and then, of course, it's possible to blacken and disavow the previous central convictions. But this is not what happened in the Soviet Union. There is the political continuity combined with the astonishing disavowal of the past. I spent a year in the Soviet Union, the past academic year, and I never quite got used to the wholeheartedness with which this was done, and the completeness with which it was done, above all in mass media, which took the lead. I mean, the extent to which this was done in public and formally endorsed pronouncement went beyond what was done in private conversation. And this again is without a change in the identity of power holders, without a violent transfer of power. Now, this again presents a problem. This really is the theme I'll try and cope with in these 2 lectures, to give to provide some understanding of these phenomena and these 2 contrasted phenomena, which share, as I say, the central theme of the absence in both societies of what we would consider adequate civil society. All right, this is like the definition of my theme. I'll approach it first of all by kind of negative qualification, but I think it's an essential step in the argument, in any progress towards clarifying this issue, namely the link between civil society and pluralism. the temptation is, in any attempt to define plural society, to define that which is lacking in those two contrasting neighbours, is to say, well, they lack civil society, i.e. the society lacks a kind of institutional plurality. Well, it's probably true, but it's not enough. And I'll highlight the fact that this is not enough by an interesting contradiction I noticed in two great commentators on both Western societies and its neighbours, namely Machiavelli and Tocqueville. When great and perceptive observers blatantly contradict each other, there must really be something there. There must be some sort of interesting feature. I mean, if it's not a contradiction due to oversight. And I'll highlight this contradiction with a couple of quotations. I mean, the basic thing about Machiavelli was that he thought that pluralism is something Easterners characteristically lack, the Eastern neighbors lack. He had in mind primarily ancient Persia, and to him the early and then still expanding and powerful Ottoman Empire. And he makes the following observations. All principalities known to history are governed in one of two ways, either by a prince to whom everyone is subservient, or by a prince and by nobles whose rank is established not by favour of the prince, but by their ancient lineage. Such nobles have states and subjects of their own, i.e., and of course then the examples of such a plural state was local power holders with their own power base. He mentioned France, with by contrast with it Turkey of the time or the ancient Persian Empire, and the implications of these two structures are very plain. He goes on to spell that out. In the case of the societies with plural, multiple power bases, invasion is easy because you can always ally yourself with one of the disaffected barons. But having got in, you're not much better off than your hapless predecessor, because the barons then make your life difficult. Whereas by contrast, he thought in these over-centralized Oriental states, once you win the crucial battle, you've got it. Afterwards it's easy. And he had in mind, of course nobody had done it with the Ottoman Empire, either then or later. But well, I'll come to that. It turned out different when bits of it were invaded. But what he had in mind, of course, the ease with which Alexander and his successors held on to the bits of the Persian Empire once they established the initial victory was won. Well, this is one contrast. Implication, we have it, they don't. Well, Tocqueville, whose observations on the Muslim world as he experienced in Algeria are no less perceptive than his observations on America and France, comes to exactly the opposite conclusion. His comments on the Algerian state, and as he was observing from afar, the state established by Abdul Qadir in opposition to the French, he remarks as follows: an emir, a Muslim king, doesn't command like the kings of Europe to individuals, each of whom can be suppressed by the social force at the disposal of the prince, but to tribes which are little nations, totally organized, one observation. And the great difficulty which a prince faces who wants to govern a confederation of Arab tribes is the following. At each moment he is faced by an organized force which resists him. And again, in Algeria there's no town or position which one can seize and thereafter thereafter remain in permanent position. So a war can't end with a single strike. If Abdul Qadir is destroyed, it will only be done with the help of some of the tribes who at the moment are his allies. The bundle of his power will be reduced rather than broken at a single go. So the observations of the East are diametrically opposite in the case of Tocqueville and Machiavelli. Neither of them were fools. Tocqueville goes on to say, Abdul Qadir acts against the tribe just as our kings, and particularly Charles VII, acted against the feudals. He creates supply units and creates an independent force which can then crush the little powers which, if united, would oppose him. And then again, very interesting passage. The great difficulty in governing those peoples is to create with them a common sentiment or a shared idea, an idea with which they could unite all of them, which all of them could unite at the same time. The only idea which could link them together, which could link all the tribes, would be religion. The prince who will govern all those tribes will always be powerful in proportion to which he can excite those shared sentiments and shared ideas. History shows that one could never do anything in common amongst the Arabs except by that procedure. It's that way that Muhammad acted, and the early caliphs, and the various princes which successively arose on the African shore of the Mediterranean in the Middle Ages. Well, the contrast in the observation is striking, and I'll come back to the final theme, the role of religion in engendering unity in an otherwise segmentary society. Now, the conclusion, the provisional conclusion, I draw a number of conclusions from this astonishing conflict in views between Machiavelli and Tocqueville. Neither of them is wrong. The societies are plural in different ways, in different parts of themselves. The plurality which Machiavelli observed in the France contemporary of his time is different from the plurality. So the plurality of feudal barons and possessors of local power bases is different from the plurality further at the margins of society, which Tocqueville observed from afar in the Algeria of the 1830s and the 1840s. They are different. Not all pluralisms are alike, and they don't have the same implications. It's an important point on the way towards clarifying the issue with which I'm trying to deal. And furthermore, point not immediately implied in what Tocqueville and Machiavelli said, but very important, neither of those two pluralisms would count for purposes of what we call civil society. Civil society presupposes pluralism, but not any pluralism. Neither the pluralism of segmentary tribes nor the pluralism of a fragmented feudal structure is what we mean by civil society, and this additional element has to be specified. Now, of course, the person who did most to underscore this, the difference between the great ancestor, to underscore the difference between civil society and segmentary pluralism, was Fustel de Coulanges. The whole point of his writing, not very long after the remarks of Tocqueville, which I quoted earlier, the central point Fustel de Coulanges was making in his ancient city is that the orators, the spokesmen, the rhetoricians, sorry, I can't get that word right, of the French Revolution got it wrong when they invoked the liberties of classical Mediterranean is a kind of ancestor, model, guide for the modern liberties claimed by the French Revolution. The resemblance was entirely superficial. What Fustel de Coulanges was doing, when he was in fact one of the discoveries of the nature of segmented societies, was to say that their liberty was quite different. The liberty of being constrained by permanent, demanding, ritually absorbing, highly underwritten segments of the ancient city are quite different from the liberty of modern, free, anonymous, and mobile societies. The rhetoric may be similar, or of course the rhetoric may be borrowed in the second case from the earlier, but there the resemblance ends. And this is part of the approach. Now, what is it? Civil society is something different from mere presence of plural, countervailing forces, such as one can find in quite different forms in the feudal order, or in the pervasiveness of segmentary units in Algeria observed by Tocqueville, and in many other societies of this kind. What is the rest in the definition? Well, I might as well anticipate the way the argument's going to go. Civil society is something unique and very strange in that it is strong enough to defy the central state without at the same time constraining the individual within them. The units which make up civil society are optional. They tend to be single purpose. They are not constraining. They are not ritually underwritten. They are somehow strong enough to make society plural and to provide effective countervailing force to the state without at the same time restricting the individual. How such a miracle has arisen, well, and what are the mechanics of its functioning and of its emergence? Well, that is the topic of my lecture, or of my lectures. Now, having successfully buttressed my argument by these great luminaries, by Machiavelli, Tocqueville, and Fustel de Coulanges, I'll now go back, at least back from Tocqueville and from Fustel, to a thinker in whom I find the clue, or rather to a thinker in whose contradiction I find the clue to the answer, namely David Hume. Now, the contradiction with which I began, between Tocqueville and Machiavelli, is not strictly a contradiction, because, it would be a contradiction if either of them had said, which they didn't, that the phenomena they describe are completely are to be universalized, that there's nothing else other than what they're describing, that the only alternative to a central state is either kind of tribal pluralism, which Tocqueville observed in Algeria, or the kind of feudal fragmentation, which Machiavelli noted in France. But of course they didn't say that. It is not strictly a contradiction. It's a contradiction if one takes their suggestiveness. This is the central contrast. Now, the contradiction in Hume is a blatant and unambiguous contradiction, and it's very, very illuminating. Now, in his main work on this topic, a work which is often cited and praised, but I think seldom read because few people have noticed the extremely interesting doctrines which are to be found in it, the work I'm referring to, is his Natural History of Religion, which systematizes, before Tocqueville and before Coulanges, which systematizes the contrast which interested both. What you might call the contrast between communal pluralism on the one hand and a centralized idiocracy or for short, and Ummah. I'll use the Arabic word to have a single term for it, on the other. Now, Hume elaborated a theory about the relationship of these two social forms, which ran roughly as follows. First of all, he condemned mankind to a permanent oscillation between centralized idiocracies on the one hand, and more tolerant pluralist communal societies on the other. The material which inspired him, of course, was very obviously, on the one hand, biblical history, Middle Ages, and the Reformation, where he identified the struggle of Old Testament unique and exclusive deity against the pluralist spirits of Canaan, that initial Unitarian thrust with a similar Unitarian intolerant thrust of the Reformation, and thought mankind would oscillate between the two. The weakness of David Hume is that he's too psychologistic, and has not quite enough of a sense of social structure, and the oscillation between these two tendencies, between idiocratic enthusiasm and communal superstition, these are his two key words, enthusiasm and superstition, the permanent oscillation in human history between these two forces, he derives from characteristics of the human heart rather than of social structure. Roughly speaking, the fact that we are cowardly and sycophantic explains our Unitarianism. We compete for the favors of spiritual beings, and in competing against our rivals, we praise one of the most powerful one, the way we do powerful beings on earth, pushing them to uniqueness, exclusivity, and transcendence, so that the tendency towards Unitarianism derives from sycophantic cowardice and competitive flattery. The opposite movement is triggered off by the need, by deference, by the need of the need of brokerage, patronage, and intermediaries. When the unique deity is pushed too far into transcendence, inaccessibility, the humble supplicator no longer dares approach directly, any more than a peasant would dare go directly to a ministry. He has to become some local lawyer to intervene on his behalf, and similarly, that repopulates the pantheon with saints. And then again, when the pantheon is overpopulated, competitive flattery again leads to centralization and so on. This was basically Hume theory. Now, it's not flattering, but it's not. There it is. Now, he draws certain conclusions from this, which are interesting. Namely, these are similar. These are what you might call the Augustan vision, which he shared with Gibbon, and which he shared much with later successor and follower of his, namely James Fraser. The conception that the pluralist, communal, segmentary religion is good, it is tolerant, it is oriented towards civic virtues, it's this worldly and communal. It teaches and endorses civic virtues. By contrast, the Unitarian enthusiasm of the idiocrats is egotistical. It teaches people to be preoccupied with their individual salvation and their salvation in another world. It's anti-civic and anti-this worldly. These are the standards, if you like, Augustan values. So he's entirely on the side of the pluralist segmentary against the intolerance, the codification of the doctrinalization of religion, its codification, the transfer of the center of gravity of religion from ritual to theory, which of course then leads to the definition of the possibility of defining heresy and persecuting it and so forth. An excellent theory, a broad theory, and insightful, and has a merit in advance of both Tocqueville and of Fustel, of systematizing the phenomena which they were later to note. Of course, Fustel noted it. Fustel was interested in it in the phenomena in connection with the once and for all transition in the classical Mediterranean from tolerant pluralism to a doctrinally and organizationally centralized religion, whereas Tocqueville, observing Algeria, was, like Hume, interested in fact, the Muslim phenomenon of a permanent oscillation between the two. But that's a minor detail. Now, there's a contradiction in Hume, and which is absolutely fascinating for anyone concerned with the nature and emergence of civil society. The contradiction is this, that he notices that if the theory, he suddenly notices that the theory doesn't apply to his own society. It's highly applicable to what happening in the Mediterranean. But if Puritan, enthusiasm is his word for doctrinal, commitment to doctrine, doctrine and idiocracy, if that kind of commitment leads to intolerance, heresy hunting, and the rest of it, well, it did. It did in some cases. It did. How about John Knox and Calvin? It had precisely those qualities in some places, but didn't have them all together, and didn't have it by his time in Britain or in Holland. And Hume notices this contradiction, and we get puzzled by it, and it comes out even in the natural history of religion. He mentioned it. If among Christians the English and Dutch have embraced the principles of toleration, this singularity has proceeded from the steady resolution of the civil magistrate in opposition to the continued efforts of priests and bigots. Well, it's to his credit that he notices the difficulty, which he calls a singularity, but the explanation is pretty feeble. It's not really good enough, and it's not much of an explanation of a striking counterexample to his main doctrine about the social implications of the two great religious styles of what you might call communal ritualism and universalistic doctrinalism. And in a very remarkable essay called On Superstition and Enthusiasm, he goes a bit further. I'll quote some of them, and he gets... He quotes some of the examples. For instance, the Molinists, conducted by the Jesuits, are great friends to superstition and devoted to the authority of the priests and to tradition. The Jansenists are enthusiasts, i.e. Unitarian doctrine embracers, little influenced by authority, in a word, but half Catholics. The consequences are exactly conformable to the foregoing reasoning. The Jesuits are the tyrants of the people and slaves of the court. The Jansenists preserve alive the small sparks of the love of liberty which are to be found in the French nation. Nice counterexample. And again, some other nice passages. The leaders of the Whigs have been friends to toleration and indifferent to any particular sect of Christians, while the sectaries, who have all a strong tincture of enthusiasm, have always, without exception, concurred with that party in defence of civil liberty. The resemblance in their superstitions long united the High Church Tories and the Roman Catholics in support of prerogative and kingly power, though experience of the tolerating spirits of the Whigs seem of late to have reconciled the Catholics to that party, again in the same essay. Now, in that essay, he formulates, he makes a much more serious and determined attempt to explain why, in this particular case, in northwestern Europe, in England and Holland, the effects have been the effects of doctrinal Unitarianism have been the opposite of what you would expect on his more general theory, and that general theory, of course, has enormous plausibility and a great deal of historical material behind it. And he formulates, in the essay on enthusiasm and superstition, he formulates three generalizations. First, superstition favors priestly power, whereas enthusiasm, Protestant type of doctrinal Unitarianism, enthusiasm undermines it even more than rational skepticism. In other words, if you want to get rid of the priests, which of course was the great Enlightenment aspiration, if you want to get rid of the priests, Puritans will serve you better than philosophers. If you want to eliminate hieratic power, the Protestant leveling of believers and the universalization of priesthood is the best method. He didn't anticipate the fact, which will be relevant to my argument when I come to deal with Marxist societies, that outright rationalism could also produce a secular counter-superstition in a new secular priesthood, but that he did not anticipate yet. And however, the first proposition, if you want to get rid of the priests, Puritans are better than philosophers. Quite important. Second proposition, his second proposition anticipates the doctrine of the routinization of charisma, later formulated by Weber, though with quite an important refinement, to the effect that enthusiastic, i.e. Protestant type religion, is more given to routinization than superstition, i.e. sort of priestly pluralism. The Puritans, or Protestant types, at the start they are indeed fast and furious, but they calm down with time, where superstition, i.e. pluralist, ritualism, tends to maintain a steady level of excitement throughout. The enthusiasm, the routinization is more significant. And then he goes in the third position, and here he comes particularly in strong collision with his main position. Enthusiasm favors civil liberty, and superstition harms it. His observation on his own in Dutch society takes him in the opposite direction from his observation on the contrast between the classical polis and the doctrinal religions which replaced him. And here his attempt to explain it is much more serious. It does invoke this, the routinization. I'll quote again. Thus enthusiasm produces the most cruel disorders in human society, but its fury is like that of thunder and tempest, which exhaust themselves in a little time and leave the air more calm and serene than before. When the first fire of enthusiasm is spent, men naturally, in all fanatical sects, sink into the greatest remissness and coolness in sacred matters, there being no body of men amongst them endowed with sufficient authority whose interest is concerned to support the religious spirit. Our sectaries, who were formerly such dangerous bigots, are now become very free reasoners. Well, it's not yet the whole story, but obviously here he's made a much better effort, and I'll come back to that, both in discussion of the origin of civil society where it's present, and of what happens in places where it is absent. Now I'll leave this problem now for the moment and turn to the theme of one of the two contrasted societies with inadequately strong civil societies, namely Islam. Now the point about Muslim world is that by and large it fits into the schema found in Hume's main theory, namely the oscillation. It's really in a world which is exhausted either by segmentary communities, and that's the communities which are plural, but where the units are over demanding, so to speak, incorporate the individuals within them, not for a single purpose, but by multiple purposes, as of course did the segmentary society of classical antiquity, where the sub-communities don't have single aims, they're not voluntary, they ritualize the activity. Both exclusion and membership are generally ascriptive, involuntary, heavily underwritten by legal, ritual, and other barriers to easy mobility and so on. In other words, where segmentary pluralism may defend members of society against a central power, but only at the cost, roughly speaking, of subjecting them to their cousins. A world in which it's either the rules of the kings or of cousins, but not freedom from both. Now, in this kind of world, the oscillation doctrine, which Hume proposed, does apply. You can only escape from the sultans by falling to the arms of the cousins, or vice versa. Either strong, embracing local communities which embrace economic life, kin life, and so on, which restrict them all, which have all the impositions which Fustel de Coulanges tried to underscore, or alternatively, a centralized, relatively unrestricted state. There is no third option. Now, for the traditional order, this unfortunate, or from our viewpoint, unfortunate exhaustiveness applies. Now, the question is, however, why within that kind of world, when it is disrupted or affected by modern conditions, had there been a strengthening rather than a weakening of religion? One of the two sub-problems are formulated. Why is it that the Muslim world is secularization resistant? Why has the power of religion within it, if anything, strengthened, certainly not weakened? Well, that is the problem, and I will now offer you a kind of solution. Whether it's correct or not, of course, I don't know. It's the best I can think of, and this is the next step in the argument, is the mechanism of the strengthening, the strengthening of religion in the Muslim world under the impact of modern technological change, or the way it's normally put in the West. Why is fundamentalism so strong in the Muslim world? It's the wrong formulation. The word fundamentalist has emerged in the West in a context where one assumes that educated people are not fundamentalists, that fundamentalism is a slightly unfortunate phenomenon amongst more culturally marginal, educationally less privileged layers of society. It's mildly pejorative, and it's understood that sophisticated people, if believers, recognize religion is true in some realm other than the literal one, and that the literal unbending acceptance of doctrines is it's not quite the cultural norm. Well, of course, in that sense, Islam doesn't have fundamentalists, because the people who are described such are not marginal and so to speak, excluded from the best norms of that society. On the contrary, they constitute the dominant norm. They are the norm. And the Muslim world doesn't have a Quran built. It is a Quran built. Now, why so? I think the premise for the answer is, let us begin with the general condition of underdevelopment, the general condition of which virtually the whole world has undergone, with the possible exception of England and its North American colonies. After the border of underdevelopment in the 18th century was, I think, the English Channel. I mean, one way of looking at the French Enlightenment is the attempt to react and compensate for this rather surprising English superiority. And then, of course, the edge of the Third World moved on to the Rhine in the early 19th century and so forth. Now, the point about underdevelopment is simply the recognition of a technological, military, or economic inferiority, embarrassing to the natures of a given society, and the attempt and engendering a desire to correct it. Now, the patterns of reaction vary a great deal, but there's the basic, what might call the standard or most characteristic pattern of reaction to development, which present in Germany in the early 19th century, and finding its classical expression in Russian literature in the latter part of the 19th century, and of course which endows Russian literature with its fascination. It's the dilemma between westernizing and populism. There are two ways one can cope with this type of situation. One is by saying, well, let us imitate those features of the superior society which make it superior, and then, of course, we shall beat them at their own game. A very logical reaction. Emotionally slightly uncomfortable, because it means expressing contempt for one's own traditions, but some people pay that price, some don't. In the characteristic situation, which doesn't arise always, where the ancien regime is too compromised, too rigid, where its commitment where its absolutist pretensions, which strengthened in the past, also make it immobile in facing the situation. That doesn't always apply. It didn't apply in Prussia and didn't apply in Japan. But typically it does arise, so that the top layers of the ancien regime are not eligible. So the alternative open to those who don't wish to tread the westernizing path is to idealize the local folk culture as possessing virtues, insights, human values, which make it superior to the technologically dominant West, and make it worthwhile identifying with the local culture after all. That's roughly the dilemma. And I think this is the common third world dilemma, and most third world ideologies contain some kind of not necessarily coherent cocktail containing those two elements. This is like the dilemma between a humiliating admiration for external model and a not quite convincing idealization of the folk variant, the court variant, having excluded itself of the local culture. Now, the main point I wish to make about the world of Islam, which I think explains, at least the best explanation I can offer, for the astonishing hold of Islam over the hearts, not only of masses, but also last part of the elites in Muslim countries. The explanation is that Islam escapes this dilemma for the following reason. It was already habituated because it had this permanent tension and oscillation between a high culture and a low culture, seized by Tocqueville, seized by, though of course Fustel wasn't directly speaking about Islam, and very much seized by Hume, because it had this permanent duality, because not under what was nominally one religion, one seamless society, it was seamless in that There were all kinds of gradations within it, and the two things interpenetrated. Nevertheless, in fact, there were two religions. There was at the bottom a pluralist, communalistic world of saint cults, local rituals, a deeply Durkheimian religion, which where the sacred is used to define the existing social groups, the embracing multipurpose segmentary units of the Muslim countryside, and at the top of the same system, a Unitarian doctrinal, codified, quote, Protestant, i.e. egalitarian, priestless, doctrine, as a scripturalist, rule-oriented high religion. Now, this dualism was there, given the need to self-reform, given the need to, as it were, react somehow or other to the sudden humiliation, which of course came in different places at different times, whether with Napoleon's invasion or with the Algerian invasion of 1830 or in other parts of the Muslim world much later. Whenever it came, the conceptual equipment was available for dramatic self-correction, which didn't need to use an outside model at all. Of course, you may say, why could they be content in trying to face the superiority of the outsiders? Why were they content with the pre-existing high culture locally available, which has always been recognized as the correct norm, even if it wasn't followed by the mass of the society? Well, I think there's a number of answers to this. It depends on what kind of definition of modernity you accept. If you take a kind of idealized self-image of modernity sketched by the Enlightenment, fulfillment, kind of all fulfillment, man within man, dominated by nature and reason and so forth, the kind of idealized self-image which the Enlightenment and its 19th century emulators provided, well, then, of course, the somewhat scholastic, puritanical, severe high culture of traditional Islam may not strike you as absolutely ideal. But if you take as a correct characterization of the requirements of the modern world something similar to that found in the sociology of Max Weber, the fit is much closer. If what a modern, more centralized, mobile, technical society requires is rule-boundedness, mobility, orderliness, and so forth, then the kind of ethos and style found in the democratic, rule-stressing, egalitarian, anti-cult of personality, on the whole, anti-magic, anti-enchantment ethos of the scholars who represent the central tradition of Islam, if that really provides a product well suited to the requirement of the new age. It has a kind of demandingness and the kind of demandingness and the promise of self-correction and recovery of equality and dignity which the situation calls for. And of course, in due course, it requires a number of other functions. As I say, its general ethos, its low load of magic, its orderliness, its egalitarianism, its low ritualism, but its provision of handrails for daily life in its prescription. In all that, it's compatible with the requirements of a society under the shadow of the coming industrial order. It also, of course, provides a national definition in a society where previously people did not think in ethnic terms, but were members of either of local groups or the wider community of believers. It provides a definition against colonial power, against colonial settler, eventually, of course, as in the case of the Iranian Revolution, against an over-westernized upper class. It provides a ratification for the ascension of the masses from a rural life to the new either urban or urban-dominated